Hey everyone, this is Theo from Headphones.com, and today I have something a little bit different for you guys. Instead of the usual IM review, today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the Sennheiser HD800S. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with this headphone, and I myself heard it roughly a year ago at the San Francisco Sennheiser store. Frankly, I remember just being completely blown away when I first heard it. Even against the HE1, I remember preferring the HD800S in some respects. With that being said, this has been sitting on my desk for the last 6 months or so, and that's pretty much just because I've found that my preferences have aligned elsewhere. So as you might guess from the video title if you've read it, this is going to be a more critical perspective of what is one of the most acclaimed headphones in the game. Let's get right into it. I'm not going to explore the presentation or the accessories too closely, just because it's pretty sparse in general, and you could probably go check out some other videos if that's more your speed. Instead, I want to take a look at the 800S itself. It is largely constructed of plastic with some metal hardware interspersed throughout. I believe the frame of the driver is metal, this headband here is metal, and then the screws for the connector points of the cups are metal as well. The end result of this is a 330 gram headphone. And if you've looked at some other high-end headphones on the market, 330 grams is pretty darn lightweight. And speaking of which, this is a very comfortable headphone. Alright, and here you can see what the 800S looks like on my head. And now you guys know why I always wear a cap in my videos. It's because my hair is a mess and I haven't gone to the barbershop in ages. That aside, I've honestly never been the biggest fan of headphones. They're just not very comfortable for me, and I've never been able to wear them for more than a couple hours at a time. But I can make something of an exception for the 800S. This is an exceptionally comfortable headphone. If you look at the pads themselves, they're shaped in something of a D, and the way they go over your ears, there's just so much breathing room for your ears that it's really hard to sort of get that sweaty effect with these headphones unless you're in a really hot environment. And then the sort of microfiber padding that they use, it's just super comfortable in general. So yeah, this is probably the most comfortable headphone that I've worn to date. I can't speak for the Meze Empyrean, I haven't worn that yet, but if you are someone who generally does not like wearing headphones, I would probably give the 800S a shot. Alright, let's dive into the sound analysis. To my ears, the 800S has a neutral reference analytical presentation. It is a highly technical headphone that places a strong emphasis on soundstage, layering, and detail retrieval. That said, it is far from being devoid of flaw, and I will be exploring some of these flaws more closely in my sound analysis. So speaking of flaws, the most glaring one is the bass on the 800S. It sounds fairly linear up until you go a little under 100 Hz, and at that point it just sort of drops off of a cliff. That of itself is not necessarily bad because you can mitigate this with EQ. However, it's when we take a look at the more intangible properties of the bass that I think that the 800S really suffers. There is a distinct lack of sort of bass tactility and texture to the bass on the 800S. And this is to the extent of which I would say that bass detail almost sounds a little bit smeared over. And I hear this not relative to just the Focal Clear, which I also have on hand, but also relative to a lot of IMs that I have on hand. So yeah, don't buy this headphone expecting good bass. Even within the context of headphones, it is just not the greatest bass that I've heard, and I think you could do much better. Conversely, the mid-range is the most solid part of the 800S's tuning in my opinion. It is definitely leaner, but it emphasizes a high degree of transparency in the truest sense of the word, at least within the context of audio. Even on a lot of the poorly mastered tracks that I listen to, and I listen to a lot of poorly mastered garbage, trust me, vocals just cut through all the extraneous sounds and all that other garbage in the mix. With that said, there are definitely some trade-offs to the way the 800S is sort of able to achieve this uber clarity in the mid-range. First, as I just mentioned previously, the bass sort of just rolls off. That, of course, is going to boost your perception of the mid-range, and it's also going to keep the mid-range from being clouded up by the bass. Second, there is a relative lack of energy at around 1 to 2 kHz. And what this sounds like to my ears basically is it cuts out a lot of the body to male vocalists. And third, I don't want to say it's sibilance, but I hear a sort of straining effect when female vocalists hit high notes. I kind of have to wonder if these notes are sort of infringing upon the HD800S's 6 kHz peak. And speaking of treble, the whole selling point of the 800S is that it has a dampener. I think it's a Helmholtz resonator, something like that. I don't remember the exact terms, but it is intended to dampen what would otherwise have been a quite bright headphone with the original 800. Yeah, it's still pretty polarizing in my opinion. I honestly did not like the treble on the 800S very much when I first heard it. Background percussive hits, they sound kind of tinny, like raindrops hitting a tin roof, and then more forward percussive hits have a certain harshness to them. However, brain burning or not, my stance on the treble has shifted somewhat over time. It certainly lends to the 800S's perception of detail, and the quality of the treble of itself is exemplary. I actually let my dad listen to the 800S and he loved the treble response. So if you're an older listener, I would imagine that this would sound pretty awesome, honestly. It's just if you're a younger listener like myself that it might come off a little bit harsh. Tonality aside, let's talk about technical performance. The 800S is often lauded as the king of soundstage and imaging. But here I'm going to give a little hot take and say that the 800S has zero soundstage depth. Vocals really do sound like they're coming from inside your head with the 800S, and they don't project in front of you at all. At first, I thought this was just me, but I ended up talking to some of my audio buddies about it, and they agreed with me actually. But they also said that my expectations were a little bit too high. Apparently even stuff like the Susvara and the Utopia, they don't have very much soundstage depth. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think that's a little bit disappointing when you consider that headphones are sort of lauded as having much better soundstage and imaging than IMs. Because frankly, I have heard IMs with better soundstage depth than the 800S. That's the only reason why I'm harping on this issue so much. But rant over, yes, the 800S has an extremely wide soundstage, and for a sense of layering, that sense of space and physicality between instruments, I have heard no other headphone that matches it. For other common metrics of technicalities like detail retrieval and resolution, the 800S is also a top performer. When it comes to the mid-range and treble, the attack transients are just super duper sharp, and then it's not in an unpleasant way either. It is just so resolving. And when it comes to micro details, so like consonances and reverb trails, the 800S is also one of the most micro detailed IMs that I've heard. I don't think its microdynamic engagement is on the same level, so for like decibel fluctuations of that micro detail, but again, super detailed, probably the most detailed headphone that I've heard yet. For macrodynamics, the 800S, while it is by no means compressed, I would not say it has that same level of macrodynamic punch and physicality that something like the Focal Clear is going to give you. Just in general, the 800S, its technical performance is a more sterile one, and it is not a super engaging one if you know what I mean. Let's do a little wrap up. To me, there's a general sense of the 800S being a superstar in some respects, and then in others being more middling or simply falling flat altogether. As a result, my relationship with the 800S has just been sort of all around the place. Like I said, when I first heard it, I loved the thing. It was endgame material for me at that point in time. When I heard it roughly 6 months ago again, I was super disappointed, honestly. My preferences had skewed elsewhere entirely. But in the last couple months that I've been listening to the 800S, it has sort of been growing on me again. And at the very least, it is a headphone that I respect a good deal. Respect really is the name of the game for me when it comes to the 800S. If you're someone who wants to analyze musical nuance at the highest level, then the 800S is a headphone that you're going to want to put on your list, and probably at the top of your list at that. On the other hand, if you're someone like myself who wants a more natural and organic listen, then I would probably steer you away from the 800S, or maybe just keep the 800S around as a reference headphone. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the 800S. I hope you guys enjoyed this more critical perspective if you made it this far, and I'll catch you guys in the next video review. Thanks so much for watching.